next session is on the topic of globalizing and decolonizing the Catalogue Raisonné, which is fascinating and sort of slightly follows, I think, the kind of theme that we were touching on in the end, which was about sort of different types of cataloging, different types of catalogue raisonné, in the context of Native American art, which poses its own special questions and approaches regarding catalogue raisonné as we know them, including the secrecy of sacred rituals related to art making, traditional categorization of makers by tribe rather than by single artist, and a culture of making that involves a community and gifting of art, and so many more questions that don't really fit into the context of art by a single author, a single artist. We're incredibly happy to have today scholar, curator, artist, and Cherokee Nation member Lara Evans. Thank you, Lara. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, to present it with questions from our own chair, Dr. Sharon Hecker. Thank you.
So we're particularly excited to have Lara here with us today. I met her years ago because we commissioned an essay in a volume on posthumous art, and we did put her essay at the end, but because it really overturned everything we had said in our volume, and it was brilliantly done and made us rethink a lot of our ideas about Western biases towards certain ways we do things. So we really can always learn a great deal from another culture, and that's why I'm so glad she made the trip all the way from New Mexico for us. Maybe Lara could speak a bit first about what the current state of Catalogue Raisonnés are with Native American artists, and I can start your slides, or you can start your slides. There you go.
Okay. OCO, hello. Dohitu, how are you?
I don't know what's the answer.
The good news is this part is very short because there are only 2 existing Catalogue Raisonné of Native American artists, and I'm only speaking about US Native American, not Canadian First Nations. There are some in Canada, but the funding structure for the arts is quite different in Canada versus the United States. So Fritz Scholder and R.C. Gorman. Those are the two existing Catalogue Raisonnés. And as you can see, each of them cover only their lithographs, not their other bodies of work. And they were produced quite some time ago. So those 2.
It's very short. Yes, and also one thing you said to me that sort of immediately knocked me out of my seat is whether when you asked people about their Catalogue Raisonnés, a lot of people didn't even know what that meant, that word. So it's not a given that Catalogue Raisonnés exist. Now, why do you think there's so few existing ones?
Oh. Well, I'll tell you about 2 that are in progress right now. One is George Morrison, and that's being done through Boakley Gallery in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And the other is of Oscar Howe, and that's being organized through University of South Dakota, headed up by Carol Cook-Go and Amy Phil with Joseph Williams, and Joseph Williams is a Dakota scholar and community member participating in this process. You'll also notice that all of these are men. So this is part of the impact of the larger art market preference and prioritizing male artists rather than female artists. I'll make sure I come back to Oscar Howe in a bit and the methodology being used there. So why are there so few existing Catalogue Raisonnés? And that goes into the structure of I call it through my work, we call it the indigenous arts ecology. There's the way things circulate within and between our Native communities, and then there's the ways objects circulate within the larger art infrastructure. And the intersections with the market, so to speak, started off with anthropological and ethnographic exhibitions in which the priority was the cultural tribal identity of the maker, not the individual identity of the maker. The emphasis was on establishing what the norms of cultural production were, not looking for the creative outliers or masters, so to speak. It was like trying to establish sort of a typical canonical understanding, but in a context what the knowledge was not coming directly from community, but was being reinterpreted through Euro-American lenses that oftentimes had a lot of misunderstandings and miscommunications, sometimes accidental, sometimes deliberate, oftentimes not recognizing that much of our cultural production was meant to be traded and exchanged, and that there is not always necessarily these like discrete, this tribe makes this thing and it looks like this and it's from this materials, but there's always this constant historically trade across long distances, and a trade of material culture was really important to intercultural diplomacy across the Americas. But the categories that collectors were trying to make were trying to establish very clear cultural boundaries from one tribe to another. So there's a lot of things that are just kind of like misunderstandings, like, no, that's not really from our tribe. This is something we borrowed from our neighbor, those kinds of things. But the way that academia tried to codify it, solidify it, and freeze it in a moment of time doesn't reflect reality. So we've got these competing understandings. And Native art started entering into the Euro-American fine art realm. I would say in the 20s and 30s, like pretty much like every decade, there was a major exhibition, like usually in New York, that was presenting Native work as art rather than as ethnographic or anthropological in context. And that's when we start getting names attached to the work. You can go into museum collections today and there'll be a lot of works that are just, unnamed artists. Even if you can go back into their records, maybe the purchase records, you might actually find the name of who made it there, but then it doesn't like follow the object into the museum exhibition. So it really takes into the 70s before we have a lot of like, oh no, we should have the name of the artist if we can find it attached to the work.
And what about, you also mentioned to me when we talked about provenance, which is such a mainstay of cataloging, and how did these get sold, or these objects initially?
Well, a lot of things were confiscated or, basically grave robbing, looting, forcibly taken from the Native communities, or forced to purchase under duress. In the case of particularly things that were used for ceremony, those were confiscated because religious practices were illegal. It wasn't until the late 70s that the Religious Freedom Act came into being, and that started to provide some protection, but it's a problem you see both in Canada and the US, that things that were part of ceremonial practices were highly valued by museum collectors and also illegal to use within communities. So a lot of objects were forcibly removed from their communities and entered into museum collections that way.
And you also talked about how they get sold at trade fairs, right?
Oh, yeah, I have a picture.
Oh, okay.
So in the indigenous arts ecology, there's a whole layer of kinds of ways that works change hands that are a bit different from the rest of the arts infrastructure. Now you may have, there's lots of very highly respected fine art fairs. There's a whole series of Native art markets, like Native specific art fairs. You can see a picture in the lower left there, that's in Santa Fe, New Mexico. There's an annual Indian art market hosted by SWAIA. It's been in existence for over 100 years. And it's, tents alongside the street, 800 to 1,000 artists who have been authenticated. That is, they can prove that they are tribally enrolled, their work is juried in, there's an emphasis, the work must be handmade. So that right there like limits the kinds of work that can be sold there. But you can see it's a very chaotic environment. So that means there's probably not records kept by the artist of what was purchased. It's not an environment that leads to the kind of archival record keeping which a Catalogue Raisonné depends upon. And I don't, so the work that's sold in these kinds of markets, there's an emphasis on things that are very clearly related to historic practices. Oftentimes materials that have been historically used. The organization was founded by non-natives who were interested in guiding the quality and authenticity of native art, as though what we want to make on our own, we cannot be trusted to do. So it was, the Pueblo pots must look like particular Pueblo styles, particular shapes, particular kinds of designs. One should be able to identify which tribe a particular thing being made for sale there is. So that's the historical pressure. There's been pushback against that. It's been over a decade. The director for SWAIA has been a series of native directors, but there's always this tension between a market of non-native buyers with a particular picture in mind of what they want to buy, and then the pressures of native creatives who want to push against those boundaries, but also people who want to continue historic practices. So there's all these competing tensions all in operation. And there's a system across the country, like multiple important markets. There are also smaller regional markets. Because of the Indian Arts and Crafts Act of 1990, it is illegal to make anything for sale and say that it's Native American if you cannot prove your tribal affiliation. So most of these fairs have some kind of record-keeping check for the authenticity, the identity of the maker. That also creates other problems because historically we have practices that involve multiple generations, family endeavors that are like essentially group made rather than a single person. So that also like, like if you were to do a Catalogue Raisonné of, say, Maria Martinez, Pueblo potter, well, her husband, Julian Martinez, helped her make her pots, and he did a lot of the decorating. After he passed, a series of their descendants also assisted with that. So that collides with the single author, single artist valuation from conventional Catalogue Raisonné.
And you were also talking to me about how just people come with the pearls, for example, and help out, and so the question of, we've talked all day since up to now about single authors, and so how do you create a catalog of that when you've been called to do a few beads, right, for your friend?
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of historic practices require participation from community. So it's like, you need your relatives and clan members to assist you. It's required as part of the practice. You can't do it all by yourself.
And also the gathering of materials you were telling me could be.
Yes, yeah. So that could be like, if it's on the plains and you're making something with buffalo hide, like somebody is going to hunt the buffalo for you and process it, and then you'll get it. Or someone will process the quills for you, and then you're working with the quills. Same thing with basketry, plant matter. It's usually a community endeavor to gather and prepare materials, and then they'll be divided off into like one person's artistic production, but it takes a large community of expertise and knowledge.
That makes it very complex to think about it in the terms we've been talking about today. What do you think that need to be improved representation? I mean, we've talked all morning about the need to have subventions and investment and have somebody to help you economically, because these catalogs are very difficult to sustain for an author. So what do you think would be some way to do that?
Well, one of the issues is that there's this a whole layer of kind of institutional and resource practices that exist in the Euro-American art world that don't exist in relationship with Native American art. So, for example, there's not a lot of publications about Native art, especially from Native perspectives. And one of the main places where like actual academic knowledge production happens is in exhibition catalogs for Native American art, which is that's not generally the practice in the rest of the art world. Like there's lots of other ways that knowledge gets out into the public and is scholarly and is recognized. But for us, it's primarily exhibition catalogs is where that resides, which are not, always considered to be, authoritative, or that like, there's a particular skewed perspective or, vulnerability about motive that could be perceived there. But that's the primary place that we have for knowledge production. There's also a canon of Native American art is like just barely formed, and most of it is from an outsider perspective. It's also the diversity of our Native communities, almost 600 federally recognized tribes, and every tribe has their own distinct philosophical traditions. The way knowledge is produced and guided within community is very different. So we can't do things as like one overarching thing unless if we're looking at it through the lens of these are items that are meant to communicate interculturally and intraculturally. So that might be one avenue that we could take. But one of the main things is we don't have the kind of archival records that are present with, built into artistic practice in Euro-American, art industry, so to speak. Not as many Native artists get MFAs, and even in the MFA programs that are out there, they generally don't include like this really deliberative training in the kind of record keeping one should ideally undertake. And for Native artists, there's additional problems or challenges. So like most reservations don't have internet or electricity in some cases. So if you're living in your own community and you're trying to have a professional career as an artist, there's hurdles that you wouldn't think of. And this is also where like ties into like, in terms of global issues, like those are conditions encountered by artists globally in other communities who are underrepresented in the field of Catalogue Raisonné. So improving, education and access for the education of artists from underrepresented backgrounds, that would be a key piece. And then legacy planning for artists. In the US, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, their legacy training program is a really important way that it's supporting artists in building their legacies and collecting the kinds of information that would be necessary for Catalogue Raisonné production. And their materials are also being used by a program at the Institute of American Indian Arts and adapted for use with Native artists. And it's like building that kind of infrastructure for underrepresented artists is important. So having archives that will collect artists' papers from underrepresented communities and do those collections on the community's terms, not necessarily always following the archival conventions that are often perceived as extractive, which is just removing knowledge from community, not giving back, not allowing community interpretation or control over the materials. Those kinds of colonial relationships have to be addressed.
So interesting, and it's really just completely different from everything we've been talking about up to now. Do you think that it's possible to decolonize the Catalogue Raisonné or indigenize it, or even for those of us who are working as art historians in a completely different world, what might that look like?
I do get asked about, is it possible to decolonize it? And I think it's not. I think decolonizing it isn't possible, because so much of how things have been collected in the past were inherently colonial, and how they're held in institutions are still inherently colonial. However, I do think there's potential to indigenize a Catalogue Raisonné. So what that would mean would be like changing some structural relationships between artists and researchers. I mean, ideally, you would have people from the artist community have like major research roles within a project. Working with living artists, which I know like opens up a whole like other set of complicated relationships and adds some challenges perhaps. But when you're working across power differentials and cultural difference, it's really important to have the artists and their community involved in the project. That means working collaboratively and not just on a surface way, but very deeply. And I'm going to say it also, multimodal, for lack of another term, I'm just inventing that, like that's, but including the multimodal practices of the artist, because there's the work that circulates in the fine art market, but for almost every artist who I know, there are hidden bodies of work that only circulate within community. And to indigenize a Catalogue Raisonné, the way things circulate within community should also be included. So the Catalogue Raisonné has to serve a purpose beyond increasing the value of the artist's work that's held by colonizing institutions. It has to serve something for the community, for the artist community, for the artist culture. And like we could think about this in terms of how we globalize it too. Like it needs to give, especially when there's a situation historically of a colonized people, that there has to be some utility to this publication for the community from which the art came. And when I say multimodal, so what I'm wearing this right here, this glass charm. This is one of Joe Fedderson's. He's in the upper left here. One of the bodies of work that he does is these really huge curtains of large scale cast glass charms based on petroglyph forms. And people always ask him like, oh, can I buy one of those? But he only gives these as gifts. You cannot buy one. So if you see someone wearing this, it means they know the artist, they have a personal relationship with the artist. This is a kind of object that is highly valued, but there is no monetary attachment to it. You cannot buy it. And all the artists that I have up here on the screen, I think they're well-known artists, maybe not over here, but Diani Whitehawk at the Met. Lily Hope is a Chilkat weaver who's very well-known. Cara Romero, a photographer. Each of them have bodies of work that are intended to circulate within Native communities. So including these multimodal facets in a Catalogue Raisonné is tracking the gift economy. Like, I hate to use the word economy, but that's a term that automatically makes things like sound valuable to the non-Native world. But those pieces that are meant to serve a purpose within community should also be part of Catalogue Raisonné. Ways to make it clear that a Catalogue Raisonné is valuable to the community of the artist is to track how the artist's work contributes to the intergenerational transmission of knowledge for the community. So why is this work important? Not just monetarily, not just economically, not just in terms of the fine art world. How is this work important to cultural continuity.
Oh, that's really very meaningful, especially even artists, Western artists who gift things and how that circulates.
Oh, and I'll say these earrings are made by Lily Hope, who's the Chilkat weaver. So of course the Chilkat weaving is incredibly valuable. Like, I would never be able to afford it, but I can buy her earrings. That's affordable.
So we have different tiers. What kind of resources are in development that you think might help people work towards making CRs more broadly relevant? Also because this year's American Pavilion at the Biennale was a Native American artist. There's growing interest. There's been many exhibitions. We see them at art fairs. So what do you think that?
Well, for Jeffrey Gibson, I would think like if there were to be a CR of Jeffrey Gibson's work, I think it should include the collaborations. It should include, recognition for the jingle dancers involved in the presentations at the pavilion. So like tracing the intercultural web of relationships between artists and community would be an important way of indigenizing a Catalogue Raisonné. And for the resources, I just wanted to say, like, there are, what you see in the fine art world is the tip of the iceberg. For all the people who get recognition or make it into the Met or MoMA or like any big important museums, there are all these layers of community members who do really important creative work in community and pass along the knowledge so that when Jeffrey Gibson goes and makes his work, he's carrying hundreds of years of knowledge along with him as a context behind the work. So I work for First Peoples Fund, which is a Native arts and culture nonprofit. And one of the projects that we do is the Community Spirit Awards, Jennifer Easton Community Spirit Awards. And this is an award that recognizes the people who are doing the work in community, passing along knowledge, training. And so some of the artists who make it into the fine art world, they have been interacting with, they have learned from people who have the kinds of careers that we recognize with the Community Spirit Awards. Lori Puyer is undertaking a big research project, going around with a film crew and interviewing a whole lot of these Community Spirit Award winners that have received this award over the last 20 years. And that kind of knowledge production of the interviews, working with people in community and uncovering those webs of relationships is really an important foundational work that needs to be done. And I think it would also benefit lots of other communities globally to take this kind of an eye toward, a CR plus. This is a shot from the studio of Jean Quick-to-See Smith, time lapse. And so she's an example of one of the artists who's been working with Joan Mitchell Foundation and their legacy program to compile the kinds of records that would go into a Catalogue Raisonné with the help of her son, artist Neil Ambrose Smith. Other resources, has anybody heard of the Institute of American Indian Arts? Okay, yay, okay. It is a tribal college. It is a federally chartered college. It's structured much like the historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. So it's federally funded, congressionally chartered. It's the only tribal college that serves all tribal nations. The rest of them are basically serving a group of tribes in a particular region. It's also the only art school. And it was founded in the 60s. And they started building an archives right away. I was the founding director of the Research Center for Contemporary Native Arts, which combines the records for the museum collection with their archival collection. So it's a one-stop shop. You go to the website and you can search for an artist's name and you will see what's in the archives and you'll see what objects are in the museum collection. This is designed to work with artists and their families and their tribes, including information made accessible. The digitization of works in the archives is driven by inquiry. So you can inquire and find out what's there. If you can't come visit, they'll scan it, and then that will be available digitally through the web portal. And there's also funding for people who want to go visit in person. It gets complicated because, but the system that was built for the archives has the capability, because there are certain kinds of knowledge that's seasonal, like some stories can only be told in the winter, for example. So if there is knowledge attached to particular works in the collection or collected in the archives that are seasonally only available, you will get a notice saying you can only access that during these months. So like building in those kinds of traditional knowledge protections is something that can be really important. And that's where, say, like a digital CR could accommodate that in a way that a book couldn't.
Fascinating. Wow. Final?
Oh, so this is a view of the Research Center for Contemporary Native Arts. So it's a really good example of building a new kind of institution with practices that are reflective of Indigenous knowledge systems, ethics, and values, and making it a resource available to the public. And there's funding anybody who wants to do research on contemporary Native art. And so basically we're talking like 1920s to now. This is a good resource. And they can also assist with using Indigenous research methodologies as part of the production.
Is that the last slide? Yes.
So I think we're
yes.
probably out of time,
We
right?
are actually out of time, yes. But thank you, Laura, so much for this really enlightening presentation. And if you have, we have 5 minutes left for questions. If anybody has something that they would like to ask. Yes, Matthew. And then after that, there's.
Thank you so much, Lara. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'm thrilled that you also brought some actual works of art with you as well, and you're wearing them. The question actually comes from the online platform. So it's one of our viewers who are following online. And the question is, to understand really, are there any statistics on the volume and value of sales of Native American art in the US? You mentioned here that the resources that are increasingly available. Is there any statistics that go with this?
There is a lack of economic data on this topic. I mean, there's a lack of data generally on Native communities in every respect, because we're 2 to 3% of the population, and usually people go, well, that's statistically insignificant. So no, I would like some.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is about oral history, and I can see you have a storytelling room and you've been collecting artist interviews. Is there a systematic way of using digital archives to record oral voices from the community of production makers? And is that something somewhere like the Joan Mitchell are looking at that, or not yet?
Not yet. This system at the Research Center for Contemporary Native Art, it's new. The room was built specifically, soundproofed. All the technology is built into the room to be less obtrusive. But there's also the issue of like consent, what knowledge is protected, who things should be available to. So for example, their system at the Research Center for Contemporary Native Art, they have the ability to collect stories that can be limited to just people from a particular clan, for example, or a particular tribe, so that that knowledge can be protective. So when things go out into the wider public in ways that may be considered inappropriate spiritually by a particular community, like the idea is that that could harm the public. So we get into different value systems about what stories should be shared by when and with whom. So like mass collection of stories, that's something that happened historically. And there's recordings in like the National Archive, like Smithsonian archives and stuff, things that should not be out in the public that are out in the public.
Fascinating. Any other questions? I'm sure people can also feel free to ask questions during lunch. So
Yes,
thank you so
Please
much,
ask
Lara.
me questions
Yes.
anytime.
Wonderful
Oh.
to have you here.
One more thing. So I spoke about the practices of gifting, and I wanted to thank you, Sharon. And this is a gift. This is a spoon carved by my father. So this is intended to be a feast spoon. Use it. Hand wash it, don't dishwash it. His maker, Mark, is here. This is not a kind of thing that he generally sells. He makes specifically for gifting. So please serve friends and family in good health.
That's lovely. It's really lovely.